Commission, to Representatives Jose Serrano, Will Hurd, and Grace Meng, sponsors of the two bills we're discussing today. I'm very proud to represent San Jose and Santa Clara County in what is a very diverse district. San Jose has the largest concentration of Vietnamese Americans in the United States, and it's also home to Northern California's largest Mexican American community. For years, I've seen firsthand how these communities are emblematic of the American experience, and I'm looking forward to hearing from our witnesses as to how we can help tell the story of Asian Pacific Americans and Latino Americans through potential new Smithsonian museums. For those who may be unfamiliar with the process by which a new Smithsonian museum is created, it typically begins with a legislatively created commission tasked with making recommendations to the President and Congress as to whether a new museum should be established and what the process of standing up that museum would look like. H.R. 4132, if enacted, would establish such a commission to study the creation of a National Museum of Asian Pacific American History and Culture. This legislation is primarily referred to the Natural Resources Committee, but given its implication for future Smithsonian operations, this committee will exercise its jurisdiction in planning carefully for the future growth of the Smithsonian. The National Museum of the American Latino has already had a commission which has produced a report and issued recommendations. And H.R. 2420 is a bill that, if enacted, would authorize the establishment of this important museum. As I mentioned earlier, before I turned on the mic, Ranking Member Davis is going to be slightly late, but he will give his opening statement when he arrives. And I would now like to welcome our witnesses. Joining us this morning, as I mentioned, is our first panel, Representative Jose Serrano, who represents the Bronx in New York's 15th Congressional District. I think I speak sadly for all of us that this is his final term in Congress on behalf of his constituents in the Bronx. Over the course of his 15 terms, Jose Serrano has pursued an agenda that reflects his core values of equal opportunity and fair treatment for all. He's a tireless fighter for civil liberties, immigration reform, and many other initiatives that benefit the neediest and most vulnerable members of our society. As a former chairman of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus and its current dean, he's been a tireless advocate for the National Museum of the American Latino. Representative Serrano, I am so glad and grateful that you're able to be here with us today. And Representative Will Hurd has spent his entire career as a public servant, first as an undercover CIA agent and more recently as a member of Congress. Since being elected in 2014, Representative Hurd has applied his expertise to his work on the Intelligence Committee and has worked to help keep our country safe. Representative Hurd is an original co-sponsor of H.R. 2420. We also will miss him next year as he has announced his retirement, but we do thank you very much for being here in support of this important piece of legislation. And Representative Grace Meng represents a district in Queens, just a short drive over the Whitestone Bridge from Representative Serrano's district in the Bronx. Representative Meng is currently serving her 4th term in Congress. She is the first and only Asian American member of Congress from New York State, the first female member of Congress from Queens since Geraldine Ferraro, and she has spent her time in Congress focusing on helping individuals in public housing and military veterans. She's a tireless advocate for children and a co-founder and co-chair of the Kids Safety Caucus. And we thank you, Congresswoman Meng, for being here. At this time, before we hear from the witnesses, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks, and that all written statements be made part of the record and without objection. That is so ordered. And I'll remind our witnesses, we do go by the 5-minute rule, so please adhere to the lights, and we'll turn to you, Congressman Serrano, first for your statement.
Thank you. And first, let me thank you for those kind words. 16 years in the State Assembly and 30 in Congress, probably enough. I leave as a chairman. I leave in the majority. I will leave in the majority. And so like some ball players, I should leave on top before it's time to go. But I thank you for those words, and I thank you for your work, and I'm glad to be here with my colleagues. Chairperson Loughran, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the committee, thank you for your invitation to testify on the importance of honoring the contributions of Latino and Asian Pacific Americans and ensuring their full inclusion within the Smithsonian Institution. I am proud to join my fellow New Yorker and colleague from Queens, Ms. Meng, as well as the Republican co-lead of our bill, Latino Museum, Mr. Hurd of Texas. As you know, Latinos have been part of this country since its foundation. Today, nearly 60 million Americans, or over 18% of our U.S. population, identify as Latino or Hispanic. As a proud Puerto Rican, I am one of them. The U.S. Census reports that by 2060, this community will reach 111 million folks in this country, or nearly 28% of our population. In addition, Latinos make up a quarter of the nation's 54 million K-12 students. We are the largest ethnic group in the United States and second only to Asian Americans in terms of growth. Latinos have left an indelible mark on our nation's history and helped shape it in ways that most Americans and even many in our own community are unaware. We have served in every war since the American Revolution, fighting bravely and paying a heavy price on behalf of our nation. We write award-winning Broadway plays and films with sports heroes and legends. We have been on the front lines of the fight for civil rights. We have shaped the music we all dance to, the food we eat, and countless other staples of American life. But Latino art and history is noticeably absent from recognition in many cultural institutions across this nation, including the Smithsonian. To deny the telling of this story not only does a disservice to our contributions and sacrifices, but also renders American history incomplete. There is no doubt that without the significant contributions of Latinos, the country we know today would be much different. Last May, on the 8th anniversary of the Latino Museum Commission report to President Obama and the U.S. Congress, which laid forth a roadmap for creating a sustainable world-class Latino museum, a bipartisan group of colleagues joined me in reintroducing H.R. 2420, the Latino Museum of the American Latino Act, which with 264, let me repeat that, with 264 co-sponsors in the House and counting, and 27 in the U.S. Senate, we're closer than ever to turning this dream into a reality. H.R. 2420 was modeled after a successful legislation that created other museums. It would authorize the establishment of a Latino museum and use the Commission's reports, vision, and recommendations to get us there. It will be paid for just as other museums have been, with 50% of the cost coming from private donations and 50% from federal funds. Next year, the Molina Family Latino Gallery will open in the American History Museum. This is a step in the right direction. But no matter how hard we try, hundreds of years of history, art, and culture cannot be contained in one of 4,500 square foot exhibit. We deserve a dedicated museum for our own in the heart of Washington, D.C. We need a Latino museum, and we need it soon. If you can do it before I leave Congress, I would be very, very happy. Thank you, Chairperson Loughran and members of the committee for having this important conversation and challenging the Smithsonian to be more vibrant, inclusive, and welcoming. With consideration of these bills, the committee will continue honoring James Smithson's wish that the institution which bears his name will be, quote, an establishment for the increase and diffusion of knowledge. I am sure he would be proud if he were here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congressman Serrano. Congressman Hurd, we'd be happy to hear from you.
Chairwoman Loughran, Mr. Walker, and to my other very, very distinguished colleagues. Thanks for having me here today. And as the lead Republican on H.R. 2420 and of the National Museum of the American Latino Act, and as a representative of a majority Latino district, I'm proud to discuss the need for a Smithsonian Museum of the American Latino right here in our nation's capital. The National Mall in Washington, D.C. is our country's front yard. It has museums for miles telling our nation's stories, stories of natural history, of air and space, of art, of buildings, of the American Indian, and most recently of African American history and culture. But there is one set of stories that's missing, the stories of the largest ethnic minority in the United States. The U.S. is home to almost 59 million Latinos and Latinas, and estimates, as Congressman Serrano said, by 2060, 1 out of every 4 people in the United States will be of Latino heritage. This bill would make the first strides towards establishing a permanent museum for the American Latino by instituting a board of trustees that will be responsible for finding a location, developing a long-term plan for construction, and advising the Smithsonian Board of Regents. Not only does this bill establish a leadership structure to make the idea of the museum a reality, but it authorizes a public-private partnership that will establish the 50-50 matching program to fund this project. Next year, the Smithsonian is opening within the Museum of American History a Latino Center, the first gallery space to celebrate the experience of American Latinos and Latinas. The space will showcase the contributions of the American Latino, like how they have served in our nation's uniform in every war since Revolution. But this space will pale in comparison to the existing museums, many of which have exhibition space well over 100,000 square feet. In just over 4 months, the National Museum of African American History and Culture hit the 1 million visitor mark, and since its opening, the museum has welcomed more than 6 million tourists. This is an indication of how successful a Museum of the American Latino can be. Our nation's investment in displaying these stories that Americans and millions of tourists from around the world will want to hear will be more than worth it. Our bill, as my partner in crime on this has said, has more than 260 bipartisan co-sponsors in the House, and my colleagues, Senator Cornyn, Menendez, Rubio, McSally, and Capito, are leading this bipartisan effort in the Senate. This isn't a Republican or Democratic issue. This is an American issue. This transcends each of us here today and will allow future generations of Americans from sea to shining sea to learn from our past, appreciate the progress made today, and work together to create a stronger future. Growing up in San Antonio, I was exposed to the rich Latino culture that is prominent in all aspects of American culture, from the music we listen to, the clothes we wear, and the food we eat, to the gifted minds of our doctors, educators, and business people. We see these accomplishments woven into our everyday lives and the very fabric of our nation. And I appreciate y'all giving me the opportunity to do this. And I will end with an experience I had about 2 weeks ago. I'm with a friend at the Native American Museum. And as we're going through the displays, my friend, who was 30-ish, had never heard of the Trail of Tears. But because we were at a museum and were able to expose and be exposed to something that is so important to our culture, to our history, we had the opportunity to have that moment, and we need that opportunity when it comes to the impact that Latino culture has had and is having in the United States. So I'm glad to be a co-sponsor of this, and I would like to also get this done before my friend and fellow member, Mr. Serrano, leaves as well. So thanks for the time.
Thank you very much. And now we'll turn to our last witness, Congresswoman Meng.
Chairwoman Lofgren, Ranking Member Davis, and distinguished members of this committee, thank you for this opportunity to discuss my bill, H.R. 4132, the Commission to Study the Potential Creation of a National Museum of Asian Pacific American History and Culture Act, a bill that I have proudly introduced each of the past 3 Congresses. I also want to thank my colleagues, Congressman Serrano and Congressman Hurd, for being here to testify in support of their legislation, H.R. 2420, of which I am a proud supporter and co-sponsor as well. And if you would like to move both of our bills before they leave, I would be very happy as well. I come before you today to emphasize the need to weave the narrative of the Asian Pacific American communities into the greater American story. After all, the past shapes who we are, just as it also strengthens how we move forward. There is no doubt that Asian Pacific Americans are the fastest growing ethnic population in the U.S., and our community is becoming an increasingly powerful and visible force in all aspects of American life. From entertainment to medicine, from academia to entrepreneurship, from social justice to innovation, our community has made invaluable contributions to every facet of our nation. But too often, our community is excluded or forgotten in history, our American history. As long ago as 1850, men were recruited from the Asia-Pacific region to the U.S. to work in mines, factories, farms, and on the construction of railroads. Since then, APAs have immeasurably contributed to the advancement of our country. From the Chinese Americans who fought at the battles of Antietam and Gettysburg during the American Civil War, to the Japanese Americans who comprised the 442nd Regimental Combat Team during World War II, and who became the most decorated unit in the history of the U.S. military. From the Chinese Exclusion Act to the Japanese American internment camps, and from the first wave of Southeast Asian refugees on our shores to the Filipino Americans who helped found the farm worker labor movement, these events have left an indelible mark on our American story. Shamefully, too often, these stories are starkly missing. From these halls of Congress to every American classroom, we also cannot forget our APA heroes who fought for human and civil rights and social justice with their every breath, including Grace Lee Boggs, a human rights activist for 7 decades, Larry Itliong, the quintessential leader for labor rights and justice, Colonel Young-O Kim, the highly decorated U.S. Army combat veteran of World War II and the Korean War, Dilip Singh Song, the first Asian American elected to Congress, and Patsy Mink, the first woman of color elected to Congress, and whose name is synonymous with Title IX. Chairwoman Lofgren, Ranking Member Davis, museums are gateways for Americans and the world to see our country's rich history, challenges it overcame, and potential for greatness. That is why a commission to study the potential creation of a National Museum of Asian Pacific American history is the first step in elevating the APA experiences. Doing so would ensure that Americans of all ethnicities and generations can learn about the impact our community has had in our nation's values, traditions, culture, and history. After all, the Asian Pacific American story is the American story. Thank you again for this opportunity to come before your committee. I ardently hope we can work together to preserve the unique histories of all Americans, including Asian Pacific Americans, for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As is our practice, we will not subject our colleagues to questioning under the 5-minute rule, but we would like to thank you for the vision that you've shown in working on these bills to make sure that the pride we have as Americans extends to every element of our beautiful country. And we thank you for taking time to be here today, and we'll call up our next panel.
Thank you.
So welcome, Secretary Lonnie Bunch. We're so pleased to have you here in our chambers again. As we know, Mr. Bunch, Secretary Bunch, is the 14th Secretary of the Smithsonian, and he now joins us for his second appearance before the committee since he assumed the role of secretary in June of last year. Though a relatively new secretary, Mr. Bunch is certainly no stranger to the Smithsonian Museum. From 2005 until 2019, Mr. Bunch served as the founding director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. Secretary Bunch took the idea of an African American History Museum. He translated it into reality. Frankly, it is an amazingly good museum. Since it opened in 2016, the museum has welcomed more than 5 million visitors and compiled a collection of 40,000 objects in the first green building on the National Mall. Secretary Bunch is also an accomplished author, having written on topics such as the American presidency to museum management. His most recent work, A Fool's Errand, I love the title, is about his experience creating the African American History Museum. We're so fortunate to have you as Secretary of the Museum and as a witness today, and please do give us your wisdom in about 5 minutes.
All right, thank you. Chairperson Loughran, Ranking Member Davis, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before the committee again today. When I was last before the committee, we touched only briefly on the topic of creating additional museums within the Smithsonian. So I'm grateful that you've decided to dedicate this time to explore the topic in greater depth. As the founding director of our most recent addition to the Smithsonian, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, I'm happy to share the insights I gained creating a museum that began without a staff, without a building, without a collection. What the National Museum of African American History and Culture has demonstrated is that the experiences of any community offers a lens to better understand our collective national identity. Its stories are the stories for everyone. It can teach any visitor something about themselves, about their history, and their country. By sharing the experiences of more communities, the better we can understand each other and our shared history. As new museum legislation is debated within Congress, it's essential that the Smithsonian not wait to provide its visitors with a broader, more inclusive history. We had hoped to be joined today by Eduardo Diaz, the director of the Smithsonian Latino Center, who was called away on family matters. But I am so pleased to be joined today by Lisa Sasaki, who's the director of the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center. Together, we can share how these centers make the Smithsonian more effective, more vibrant, and more meaningful by embracing an inclusive vision of our history and our culture. I know that you share our vision for telling a more complete and complex history of our nation. While my memories of opening the National Museum of African American History and Culture are vivid, so are my memories of how difficult it was. I quickly realized that the opening was still just the beginning of a long journey. As the head of the institution of the Smithsonian, we will be responsible for any new museums, and it's my obligation to ensure that Congress is fully aware what it means to place this responsibility on the Smithsonian. Any new museum must meet the expectations the public has for a national museum. This means appropriate size, programming, and collections. We must contemplate the needs of staff, and we must be comfortable in crafting an institution that has the right site. There must also be a wonderful location because these buildings are powerful symbols of how we as a nation value the contributions of the people they represent. While I know everyone here would like to know how much a new museum would cost, we simply don't have enough information to provide a precise answer. The cost of construction are tied ultimately to the site and the challenges that location may present. Given expected construction cost increases and the challenges of preferred sites, a comparable new museum will likely exceed the cost of building the National Museum of African American History and Culture. It is so important to note that the costs do not end with construction. The annual operating costs of a museum alone are significant, but the true costs are also spread throughout the institution. Many functions of the Smithsonian are centralized, such as maintenance, security, and a general counsel. We cannot let additional museums detract, but rather enhance our ability to staff, and tell the stories for all Americans. Finally, it is important that Congress understands the impact of new museums can have on our ability to maintain our aging infrastructure. Several of our iconic buildings are slated for or currently undergoing extensive renovation. Others are in need. As this committee is well aware, our backlog of maintenance costs has exceeded $1 billion, and many facilities continue to fall behind. I would like to thank you, however, for the bipartisan support you have shown in helping us manage this problem and supporting a more sustainable path for the institution. We are continuing to look at new ways to assess and address this backlog, and Congress must understand that bringing a new musician to fruition will increase these challenges, but challenges that I think together we can overcome. When building the National Museum of African American History and Culture, I saw Congress as an essential partner. As Secretary, I will take the same approach. It is imperative that we work collaboratively to ensure we can meet all of our challenges, new and old. And I am sure that we can build museums worthy not only of the Smithsonian, but worthy of the communities that the museum represents, with the right support from Congress. I stand ready to answer any questions you have, because I am excited about the opportunity to discuss the future of what may happen at the Smithsonian. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Secretary Bunch. I just wanted to put something in the record. I don't think everyone knew. I think you are aware. But Ranking Member Davis and I sent a letter to the Appropriations Committee last year asking that they fund the deferred maintenance backlog fully for the Smithsonian. This has been building over the years. It's not because of these proposals. And Mr. Davis and I had discussed back a long time ago, I think Mr. Davis was on the staff, I was a new member, when Vic Fazio decided it was time to get caught up. And that's when we did the maintenance and really renovated and saved the botanical gardens. It's when we basically saved the old Library of Congress, which was falling apart. And we think it's time to do that with the Smithsonian, not to let maintenance deferred ultimately cost us more because we have not paid attention. And we've not given up on this idea, and I want to recruit the other members of the committee, especially one member who is on the Appropriations Committee, to see if we can't get that done, because in the end it's going to cost us more, and these beautiful institutions really are in trust for us for the future and for the public, and we want to make sure that we're doing the right thing. Having said that, in a way, a fool's errand, your new book, hopefully that will not be the case with these two proposals. We're having this hearing because we do hope to move forward on these two. I was struck by something that you said at the last hearing where you were present, where it was something to the effect that if you never start, you never finish. And so I think it's important to start. That's not a guarantee that we get to the finish line, frankly. This is an authorization. But we'll never know if we don't start and if we don't try. Let me just ask you this, Secretary Bunch. When you take a look at the Latino American Museum as well as the Asian American Museum, we have a very diverse Asian American community in the United States, a very diverse Latino community in the United States. How do you approach that in making sure that as we are inclusive, we're inclusive in the whole community? How would you do that?
I think it's important to realize that the key to the success of any Smithsonian institution museum is scholarship. And the scholarship allows us to understand the diversity within these communities. It's a challenge to figure out how to do that, but it's something that can be easily done with good scholars and with good curators. I think the most important thing for me as I think about new museums is to recognize that it's a two-sided coin. That on the one hand, it's an opportunity to finally tell stories of communities, their own diversity, their impact, the challenges they faced. But I think to be the kind of institutions we really want, they also have to be the other side of the coin that says, here's how you use Latino culture or the story of Asian Pacific Americans to better understand what it means to be an American, to recognize that this is a story that shapes us all, not just a community. So I think it can be done, but it's a challenge. It means good leadership and good scholarship.
Let me ask you this. I think back to some of the efforts that have been made just in my own little community, and I'll just mention two examples. We have Norm Mineta was born in San Jose in what was then called and still is the oldest Japantown in the United States. And a group of elders decided to open a little museum. And they did it with artifacts from their own community. And it's small, but it's really quite wonderful. And they honor the Japanese Americans who walked out of the internment camps volunteering to fight in World War II, and ended up being the most decorated unit in the entire history of the military service in World War II. And they have artifacts from the families of that unit and other things. Second museum, I have a large Vietnamese American community. Those refugees struggled. They came in little boats fleeing from communism and are so happy to live in this free country. And they have a little museum, again, made up of the artifacts and the people who fled in boats or who fled from the communists. Would you think about accommodating those types of activities that are sort of indigenous in a way, but are very real? How would you deal with that?
Let me use the example of what we did with the National Museum of African American History and Culture. There are literally 150 small museums around the country that look at African American culture. And there was great concern that if you create a museum, does that hurt us? Are we left?
Well, they're not concerned in that way. Let me make that clear.
But I think what's important is that what we realized is that a national museum ought to draw people to Washington, but then push them back to local museums. So let people understand that you can't build these national museums without recognizing that you're standing on the work that's done at these small institutions. So my goal would be to always celebrate those institutions as part of the foundation of creating any national museum.
That's really wonderful. Thank you so much, Secretary Bunch, and I'll turn now to Mr. Walker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Bunch, let me say you've done a great job, and I appreciate, as we were talking about earlier, the heart and energy that exists in the African American Museum, and hope that that is something that continues to be part of our future in representing, honoring all cultures. A couple questions, though. The Women's History Museum Commission report indicated construction cost of the museum would be fully financed by private funds. In your opinion, is that model really possible? We just want to have kind of an answer in the sense of knowing what we're facing moving forward as we work bipartisan to try to get there. Is it possible? And if not, why isn't it?
I think that makes the hill a very steep hill to climb.
Okay.
I would argue that what is crucially important is a public-private partnership. That what that does, it allowed me, for example, building African American Museum, to talk about how the support from Congress could be then leveraged from the private sector. And that, in essence, many people in the private sector said, we want to help as long as we see that Congress is also part of the process. So can it be done without congressional support? Sure it can. But it makes it a much, much more difficult task. And that I am so grateful that the legislation to create the African American Museum had it a 50-50 split.
Yeah. It is very clear, as recently as Super Bowl Sunday, the incredible history and impact musically and culturally the Latino community has made on our country. The National Museum of American Latino Commission report laid out a plan of which no federal funds would be required for the first 6 years of planning and pre-construction work for a new museum. Once again, just from a clarity standpoint, do you think that approach could work?
I think that one of the great successes of what would make make any new museum work is to have some congressional support up front so that they can find the staff to help raise funds, that they can plan better what this museum should be, which will get people excited. I just think that it really has to be a public-private partnership.
I've got one more question, but I want to get off the paper for just a second. Part of the attraction to the African American Museum is just the atmosphere and the energy that was captured in that. Do you think that can be duplicated in these other arenas as well? That you don't walk through the African American Museum without being moved tremendously. Is that something that you foresee could be in other museums honoring different people groups or women in general?
There's no doubt in my mind that the sense of intimacy, the sense of reducing history to human scale, the sense of drama that is at the African American Museum can be replicated, done even better in these new museums. So my expectation would be that they would be places that you would revel in the past, but you'd feel an intimacy that would shape who we are today and maybe even point us towards who we can become as a nation.
Your answer was much more articulated than even my question, so thank you. So my final question here, the CBO prepared a recent cost estimate for HR 1980, the proposed Smithsonian Women's History Museum. Based on a 50-50 private federal funding model, the total construction costs would be around $484 million. Do you believe this is a realistic funding level for construction of a new museum? In the past, frankly, we've seen lots of cost overruns and even delays. Does this cost estimate account for those items, and if not, should it, or why?
I think it's a reasonable estimate. I think that you've got to realize that if you're going to build a museum of a size that's credible, it means that you're going to spend $300 to $400 million just to construct the building. But you also then need another $90 to $100 million to do the exhibitions, to build the collections. So I think it's a number that's in the ballpark. My expectation would be that it would probably cost more than it cost to build the African American Museum.
Thank you, Secretary Bunch. Your expertise is very valuable. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Davis has arrived and said that he's going to put his opening statement into the record, which we, by unanimous consent, will do. And we will turn to Ms. Davis.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and welcome again
Thank you.
to the committee and bringing your expertise and your vision with you. You know, I picked up from your words a kind of cautionary tale, I guess, at this point, and just wondering if you could expand on that a little bit. One of the things that you mentioned, which was so critical here, is the scholarship and bringing together, you know, all the expertise and gathering that up, which was the job that you had with the African American Museum of Culture. How do you see that then? Is that something that we have, it's kind of like sitting there ready to go? Or is that something that really is a process over 5 years, 10 years? Where does that fit?
One of the great strengths of looking at the potential Latino Museum or Asian Pacific American Museum is that the Smithsonian has these two centers that are already doing a lot of this work, that are building the relationships with scholars, that are testing ideas and programs and education, which the African American Museum didn't have. So in some ways, these centers are crucial, whether we build a museum or not, but they'll allow the process to move more quickly. I think the challenge is that no matter what we do, it's going to take several years of planning, of really getting to know the audiences, understanding what people want and how to then translate that into a concrete form. But I think that what excites me is I listen to Eduardo Diaz or Elisa talk a little bit about the work they're doing, and I think what a wonderful foundation that is.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, though, whether there is a sense, you know, of because they've brought those elements together already, essentially, whether there's an impatience then, and how can you address that so that it is a standalone which has a different feel to it?
as somebody whose whole career has been shaped by a desire to not erase history, to expand our understanding of who we are as Americans, I like the fact that there's a lack of patience, right? That it's really important to make sure we tell these fuller stories. I think what is important is to recognize that the Smithsonian believes that we have to tell these stories regardless of whether there's museums or not. We are prepared with the right leadership from Congress, with the right understanding, to craft museums that are full of wonder, that'll enrich us as a community. But we're also prepared to make sure that we build on the work, that support you've given us, to be able to bring in curators who are transformative, to be able to do the kinds of programs to make sure that people see the Smithsonian as what it is, a place that helps us understand all of who we are, not just part of who we are.
Thank you, appreciate that. And I'm wondering, just in responding to the chairwoman, whether the opportunity to fund the deferred maintenance, does that give you a sense of I guess, more preparedness to move forward? Because again, you know, trying to have eyes wide open here, taking on too much can be problematic, but does that make a difference so that we make sure that the deferred maintenance is taken care of in existing museums?
When I became secretary, I won't say the biggest surprise, but the sort of thing that really struck me was that we've got to wrestle with this deferred maintenance. It's too important not to, and we don't want to just push it down the road. I think that if we can make sure that we do get the support that allows us to continue our creative way at looking at maintaining this deferred maintenance, to be able to restore the Air and Space Museum, that allows us to take away $200 million of deferred maintenance, to really think strategically how we do it, then I think we can move in the directions of new institutions. But I think without recognizing the impact of these on the Smithsonian, I think what it does is it slows the process. It makes the process something where the Smithsonian is fighting within itself, rather than rallying around to craft these new institutions.
We'll look forward to your expertise as we move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Davis is recognized for his questions, and thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And following up on my colleague, Ms. Davis's questions on deferred maintenance and the backlog, look, I appreciate what you do. Sorry we saddled you with Shimkus on the Board of Regents, but, you know, he's really enjoying the opportunity, and I know he speaks very highly of the entire board. We want to see you succeed. We want to see the Smithsonian continue to be the worldwide institution for history, and especially our history. But the deferred maintenance backlog that Ms. Davis mentioned, it really concerns a lot of us too. It's upwards of $1 billion right now. Your appropriations for maintenance are actually below industry standard, which is an obstacle to this backlog. What's the impact on your current facilities, including some of the most visited museums in the world, like the Air and Space Museum and American History Museum, if new museums are added to your portfolio?
There is no doubt that we've got to figure out the way to address that so that we're really reducing our backlog. There's no doubt about that. I think that I really take a lot for the support you've given us for the Air and Space Museum. All that renovation is really allowing us to reduce that backlog. We're going to have to think very creatively, and what we've done, as I mentioned before, is look at it from a much more strategic way, to really analyze where the real needs are so that we're putting our resources in addressing what is the most significant crying out needs. Also, though, because of your support, we're able to do more preventative maintenance, which I think is the way we want to make sure that we don't have this challenge with the African American Museum. We're doing more in the Museum of American History. But I think the point is that we have to do this with both hands. If we create something new, we've got to make sure what's old is taken care of as well.
I agree, and I'm very supportive of the concept, but we also want to make sure that you have the resources at the Smithsonian to continue to put the best of the best museums to honor our nation's history like you have. But if that maintenance remains at the current level, what about 10 years from now? What's the state? You know, we're doing well with the Air and Space Museum and some of the backlog there and preventative maintenance. You know, if we don't make changes to how we address the maintenance backlog now, what do you anticipate these museums will look like in 10 years?
Well, I think that it's hard for me to sort of say in 10 years it will be X. What is clear to me is that we have people working very diligently on what are all the things we can do to reduce that backlog, to make sure, for me, the most important thing is to make sure that the visitor experience at the Smithsonian remains high and wonderful and treats people effectively, but also it's crucially important that we maintain the collections. And so what I'm doing is what any leader does. You juggle, right? You want to make sure that we have the resources that we need, and I want to put a lot of our attention on maintaining that. And so we really are appreciative of the support that you've given us in this regard. At some point, it's crucial for us to simply say, are there new ways we can think about maintaining and attacking the backlog? And that's something we're working on.
Well, we appreciate that, and I do have a question later about storage capacity, and if we don't get to it, I'd love to be able to get your a written response later, because I think it's important for us to understand the issues that you may face when it comes to storage collections when you have the opportunity to have more artifacts come in for newer opportunities and ideas. But I do want to address in my last question, in testimony before this committee, your predecessor, Secretary Skorton, stated that the Smithsonian did not have the capacity to bring new museums to fruition, giving other competing challenges, which is not what we want. We want to see new museums like those discussed here today. But do you share that concern, Mr. Secretary?
I share the concern that we have to address this backlog, but I believe that with your leadership and with our creativity, that with the resources that we need, we can begin to build new museums if necessary.
We've got, I agree with you. The federal budget for the Smithsonian is about $1 billion. Mm-hmm. If additional funding is required to support new museums and to meet other priorities, can you give me a range of what you think it might you might make as a request for us to continue to provide you the resources for new possibilities and for existing museums?
Well, I'd like to really come back to that and give you an answer. I think it's important to recognize that if you build a new museum, after you've built it, then the costs are probably anywhere from $25 to $40 million annually just to operate the direct cost. Then there's probably another 40 to 60 million that is really the cost to make sure that you can provide the security, that you can make sure that you've got the contracting to support that. So there are costs, and that's what I meant by saying if we're going to do things like this, we've got to realize that opening the museum is just the beginning.
Great. Thank you. I yield back, and I really enjoy working with you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Bunch, welcome.
Good to see you.
How do you determine the appropriate size of a museum?
You look at several things. First of all, you look at the visitation you might expect. There's a certain number that your Smithsonian will always get. You also look at the stories you want to tell, how many exhibitions you need to tell. You want to look at whether or not you have on-site storage or off-site storage. So you look at a variety of factors. You also look at what the site allows you to do. And what we've discovered is to be able to do a building that serves the public, also protects the staff and gets the right amount of staff, it's about 350,000 square feet. That's sort of industry standards here at the Smithsonian.
So what are the major challenges presented by creating a new museum, and what are the major benefits of creating a new museum?
You got 3 hours? I can. I think that there are many challenges. Obviously, the challenge of balancing new with old, right, to making sure that we're taking care of the entire Smithsonian. It's crucially important to realize that we've got to build a strong fundraising apparatus from the very beginning so that we can make sure the resources that are there from the private sector. It's also essential to build a strong staff. And then most of these museums, like the African American Museum, will have to build collections. So to think about what are the variety of strategies that allow you to find the stuff of history that people need to see. But maybe more than anything else, it's important to recognize how do these new museums find the right balance between tradition and innovation? What's the role of technology? Does that add additional burdens? Does that save us costs? So ultimately what you're really doing is on new museums, from the African American Museum on to anything new we build, what you're saying is it is no longer acceptable just to be something that serves audiences in Washington. So what are the ways you reach beyond that? So all of that are part of some of the challenges. One of the benefits is really that the history of America is so complicated that no one building can do it. But the Smithsonian has this amazing opportunity to create different portals into what it means to be an American. A portal that may go through the Air and Space Museum or the African American Museum. And what that does is means that even if you're thinking about your only interest in technology, suddenly you can see connectivity because you're at the Smithsonian. That's something that doesn't happen anywhere else in the world.
So I wonder if you would reflect for a moment on the experience of the African American Museum, since you were the founding director of it. Specifically, if you would address the original points of skepticism that were leveled against the museum, and then how the experience since has responded to the original kinds of criticisms that were leveled against the idea.
Well, first, the notion was that this museum had been floating around for 100 years, so it would never happen. So part of the strategy was making the museum exist from the day I started, not waiting for a building. Birthing the museum online, doing traveling exhibitions, and basically creating a space in the Museum of American History that now the other museums are building on. I think that was crucially important. I think one of the real challenges were that many of the smaller African American museums were very concerned that this would take away resources. But what has happened since then is the visibility of the museum, the excitement about African American culture has led to increased visitation around the country, has led to more support from local governments for these kinds of institutions. I think the biggest challenge was to think, what does it mean to be a 21st century museum? What's the role of technology? What's the role of reaching out? And I think the museum sort of invented a lot of new things that we can build upon. So ultimately, the key for us was to think about how do you craft a museum? And the fundamental question I would ask is, how do you craft a museum on the mall that's part of the Smithsonian that serves a community but serves more than that community? That, I think, is one of the fundamental questions.
Well, I appreciate that, and I just want to tell you, a week doesn't go by when I'm not there, a day or two a week for different events. It's become such a spectacular asset, not just locally, but nationally. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. Thank you for your leadership and guidance. I'm a huge fan of the Smithsonian's. It's been part of my heritage growing up, the excitement of seeing the artifacts, being in touch with our history, our heritage, our culture. And I'm invigorated by the idea and the vision of moving forward. One of the things about Smithsonian institution that I think resonates with people is quality. There's a term back home, especially if you see like the museum I have in my district, the Southern Museum of Railroad Heritage in Kennesaw, Georgia, the site of the beginning of the Great Locomotive Chase during the Civil War. Been a museum for years. Smithsonian partnered, and now the term is it's a Smithsonian quality museum. And I think that is a very, very important aspect. So my concern is continuing that level of quality, the viability going forward. And there's really three things, as a business owner in the past, there's three things that can really harm a business. Being undercapitalized during the growth period, the first 3 to 5 years, you don't have enough capital to go forward and grow. The other thing, once you're past that period, is the lack of growth But there are many businesses that fail because of excessive growth that they cannot keep up and maintain their current customer base or their current product. And it causes the collapse of very viable businesses. I'm going to echo some of the concerns we have here because I'm with you. We want to make this happen. You've got to have growth in business. If you're stagnant, people tend to move on. Even if you're providing a good product, they're always looking for better. So it is important to grow, but with the maintenance backlog, a nearly $1 billion cost of the renovations that are greatly needed to the Air and Space Museum, my concern is, and I hear what you're saying, that you got really good people dedicated to eradicating this backlog, but is there a plan in place that says from this date to this date, we are going to eliminate the backlog we know of now? And that's just, I don't know that we've really got our hands wrapped around. I know that, yes, part of leadership is juggling, but also part of leadership is a plan with benchmarks that you can get to. If you would mind responding.
Sure. I think that I've said as soon as I became secretary, that's one of our major priorities, to develop that plan. We've got parts of it in place. We don't have a complete plan, and that's something we're working on. But I think it's also key for us to understand that that plan is going to mean we're going to have to tap our fundraising to see if that's a way to begin to address it. We're going to have to tap how we're already doing some restorations and renovations in our old buildings. We have to look at how do we move up so that we're spending more of our money towards that maintenance. And the key for us was preventative maintenance. And so the support we've got a plan on how to make sure that we don't continue just to grow the backlog, that we actually put a cap on it. And so that's what we're working on, and there'll be a more detailed plan as we move forward.
Are there outside sources of revenue that can bring things in? Like one of my favorite television channels is Smithsonian Channel. Sure. I love Aerial America. I mean, it's kind of a go-to program for me. Do you receive any revenue from that, from advertising? I mean, are there sources like that we can, I never want to see us charge for the actual museum. But are there outside revenue sources that we can invest in to grow?
We've looked at all the things that we have sources of revenue coming in. We're looking at, are there, for example, we have an endowment for the facilities that probably throws off $50,000 a year, which is not much. So to think about, as we look towards maybe another capital campaign, is that endowment a crucial part of it? So is that going to allow us to put more money into deferred maintenance? Okay. We're looking at all the opportunities we have at this stage to see where we can take resources to go in this direction.
Last question real quickly. You testified that the mall area, this was in the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, is now a floodplain, could potentially be subjected to floods. Is it wise for us to look at building new museums actually in that area if that is a concern?
One of the things that we've looked at is, are there models that say we shouldn't build in in that area? Are there models that say we should move museums? And there aren't. What we've had to do is, when we built the African American Museum, we built that recognizing that there's going to be rising water, that it's a different environment, and we built systems in place to ensure that we can protect that precious treasure. We've also made, in areas where we couldn't build new, we've moved collections out of lower levels just to make sure that we're protected. So like all of us, we are wrestling with what this means and how we address it, but we think we've moved in a smart way to make sure we've protected the collections right now.
Thank you.
Congresswoman Budge.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I just really have two questions. One is, for the museum honoring Latinos, there was a capital site that was, or a recommended site for the museum, which we understand can accommodate a building of about 250,000 square feet. Is that large enough, or are we putting ourselves behind the 8 ball before we start? And does that will it accommodate storage and administrative offices in that space?
At 200,000 square feet, what you really have to think about is Collections will not be able to be housed in a place like that. I'm not sure that's large enough for the staff that would really need to handle that. And I also think there is a symbolic issue, and that is the question of people who expect new museums expect them to carry the weight like other Smithsonian museums, that the buildings themselves are part of the symbol. And a building of 200,000 square feet may not be large enough to do that.
So what then would be your recommendation to the committee? Because clearly, I don't think it's big enough, knowing what we already have. What would you then do with your storage needs? What would happen with that if that's the site that were selected?
I think that what we'd have to do is look candidly what we did with the African American Museum. We had two options. One is, do you build new storage areas like out in our Suitland campus or out on Dulles? To build a new storage unit costs, over $100 million.
In addition to the cost of this building?
Oh, absolutely. Or do you take rental spaces? We rent space out in Pennsy, and that's a cost that's going to hurt us down the road. So what you want to do is recognize, though, that the mall is sacred space, so you do want to use as much of that space as possible for the visitors and for the services that need to be there, and you want to have minimal collection storage, and then you've got to find another place as your collections grow.
Right, and so I just want to be clear that that then becomes a significantly larger cost than the cost of the museum, which is what we are talking about today, so that people are aware of the fact that it's going to impact a lot of other things, including possibly your other plans for other museums. The other thing is there, and if there is, please let me know, a fundraising plan for the museum? Do you know if there is one, and if so, what it is?
I think at this stage, it's too premature to have a fundraising plan. You'd really want to sort of think about exactly the location, to have leadership think about what are the products that you want to produce, exhibits, et cetera. But what's crucial then is to have the support so that you can hire fundraisers very early in the process. I don't think we're there yet, but that is something that I would argue needs to happen very shortly after a museum is being willed into existence.
Well, I would just close by saying that I wholeheartedly support the museums, but also we have some fiscal responsibility to the taxpayers to be sure that we are acting in an appropriate manner as we start to move down the road with this. So I thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Aguilar from California, and also a member of the Appropriations Committee, who we're looking to help us get our deferred maintenance funds.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and I think with that pressure in mind, I'll just kind of start down that path. Mr. Secretary, your budget request is, as my colleagues had mentioned, for fiscal year 2020, you requested $219 million for the facilities capital account. You were appropriated $253 million. So I guess my first question would be, how do you plan on using the additional $34 million that you were appropriated? The second piece of that is the specific list of 16 projects that you mentioned within the 219 request. Are those still valid? Are those estimates? Are those is the completion of those projects still possible given the dollars that we were appropriated?
Well, I think the estimates are still accurate.
Okay.
And what we want to do is use some of the additional resources to really focus on preventative maintenance, to really make sure that we're just not continuing to dig a deep hole. I think that the additional support allows us to be even more creative in how we use and how we address this. It also reminds us that it's going to take a concerted effort with Congress, finding some other sources as well, because this is really a challenge that we've left for so many years that it's going to take more than 2 or 3 or 4 years to fix it.
Sure. And I don't want you to get ahead of OMB and the president's budget next week, but just among friends here, what would be the capital request? What would be the ballpark of the capital facilities request that you might propose to the Appropriations Committee?
I'd love to get back to you with that,
Sure.
because we're still grappling with what we think is the right number.
Sure. I look forward to monitoring that across the process. And as the chairwoman said, we're serious about addressing this, and maybe it takes some bold action on our part in order to really chip away at this backlog in a big way. But we're serious about meeting those obligations as well as honoring the commitment. You sat there and heard our colleagues talk about some of these ideas for future plannings as well, and I know that you've had a lot of those conversations. I appreciate you attending the Hispanic Caucus meeting a few months ago with Eduardo Diaz, and you talked a little bit about the Molina Family Gallery opening in 2021. The exhibit's going to have bilingual stories and a cross-cultural audience as well to enjoy. Given the state of play, and this is similar to questions you heard in that meeting, given the state of play in our country when it comes to race relations, can you speak to what steps the Smithsonian Institution is taking to ensure that 4,500 square foot exhibit can adequately represent over 600 years worth of diverse Latino American history?
One of the things with the Molina Gallery that I've asked is give me a 5-year to 10-year plan of what else you would do in the gallery. That the plan is to have an opening exhibition that frames the broad issues, explores the community, but clearly one exhibit is not going to get us to where we really need to be. But I think if we look, much like I did with the African American Museum, look at an array of issues that we can explore over the next 4, 5, 6 years, that begins to get at this, because the most important thing the Molina Gallery does is twofold. One is to sort of firmly say to the Smithsonian and say to the Smithsonian's public, this is so important that we want to give it square footage. That's, when you come to see it, that's important. But the second thing is, it should be a space that allows us to test ideas. Test the way the audience engages, test the way different communities think about the experiences, so therefore we can then improve, and if we move down a road towards a museum, we've actually laid a strong foundation.
I appreciate it. One of our goals is, as you heard with our colleague, both of whom are retiring, Mr. Serrano and Mr. Hurd. We want to move that bill. We want to mark that up, and we want to move it in a strong bipartisan way. And part of that is obviously making the case that the exhibit space that we're going to be utilizing is done appropriately. Appreciate the steps that you're taking in that regard. What process are we going to use? And I know you're talking about kind of making that case and having that kind of a long-range view. What opportunities for collaboration are included in that within the role that Mr. Diaz plays, as well as within your role and in others? What are different opportunities where folks can say, hey, try this out, or why don't you include this era, or do a little bit more of this instead of that? What opportunities for collaboration and input do you see in a more formal way?
I think it's important to realize that the Smithsonian is in a networked age, that it's no longer has broad enough shoulders to carry everything. And it's got to find ways to both collaborate with museums that care about the subjects we want to explore, to help us look at new ideas, but also to help us convey our ideas outside of Washington, so that what you want is a kind of mutually reciprocal relationship that is a long-term commitment that improves both the Smithsonian and local entities. I think the other thing is to make sure that the Latino Center, the Smithsonian, is doing a much better job developing new support, new interns, new fellows, so that we're really making sure that we've got new generations of, if not museum people who can shape museums, at least museum consumers who can support it.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yield back.
Yields back. Mr. Secretary, it's always an honor to have you here, and we're very proud of you and grateful that you are the Secretary of the Smithsonian. And thank you for answering our questions and for the terrific job you're doing.
Thank you very much.
All right,
Appreciate
so
it.
now we'll call up the third panel. So welcome to everyone. I'm going to introduce first Henry Munoz, who is the chairman of the National Museum of the American Latino Commission, a legislatively created independent commission established to study the feasibility of creating a museum dedicated to Latino American culture within the Smithsonian. In addition to leading the commission, Mr. Munoz has served the Smithsonian as vice chairman of the Smithsonian National Board, chairman of the Smithsonian National Latino Board, and trustee of the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum. He's also chairman of the board and chief creative officer of Munoz and Company, one of the largest and oldest minority-owned design practices in the country. We also have Beth Lou Williams, who is an associate professor of history at Princeton University and a historian of race and migration in the United States, specializing in Asian American history. Her recent book, The Chinese Must Go: Violence, Exclusion, and the Making of the Alien in America, has won a variety of awards, including the Ray Allen Billington Prize and the Ellis W. Haley Prize from the Organization of American Historians, and the Sally and Ken Owens Prize from the Western History Association, as well as the Vincent P. DeSantis Book Prize from the Society of Gilded Age and Progressive Era, and the Carolyn Bancroft History Prize, a book I think we probably have to get and read. Prior to her time at Princeton, Dr. Lou Williams was a new faculty fellow at Northwestern University, appointed in History and Asian American Studies. We have Lisa Sasaki, who is the director of the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center, a museum without walls that brings Asian Pacific American history, art, and culture to communities through innovative museum experiences online and throughout the country. She's also a frequent guest lecturer for museum studies graduate programs, and prior to her time at the Smithsonian, Ms. Sasaki served as the director of the Audience and Civic Engagement Center at the Oakland Museum of California and the director of program development at the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. And finally, last but not least, Eric Peterson is a specialist in American national government in the Government and Finance Division of the Congressional Research Service, where he has worked for 2 decades. He conducts research and provides policy analysis support and training for members of Congress and their staff. His research areas include the Smithsonian Institution, congressional administration and staffing, constituent service management, and the Government Publishing Office, which, by the way, we will be having an oversight hearing on that in the coming weeks. Dr. Peterson earned undergraduate degrees at the Community College of Philadelphia and the University of Pennsylvania. His graduate work includes a master's in public administration from Virginia Tech and a PhD in political science from Syracuse University. In addition to his work at CRS, he is a lecturer at the John Glenn College of Public Affairs of The Ohio State University. Thanks to each of you. I'll remind you that your statement should be about 5 minutes, and then we'll go to questions. So, Mr. Munoz, we'll turn first to you.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, members. It's an honor to be here today to provide testimony regarding the many decades of work held aloft by so many people across this country: scholars, curators, historians, scientists, teachers, artists, activists, business people, volunteers, and everyday citizens. I'm one of them, to answer the question of whether there should be a National Museum of the American Latino in our nation's capital. I'm here today not just as the chairman of the commission to establish a National Museum of the American Latino, but as the first Latino in the 173-year history of the Smithsonian to ever serve a term on its national board. Mainly, I'm here because I grew up in South Texas during a time where the stories of people like myself and our families were not included in museums or archives or libraries. Our commission, after working for almost 2 years, found the answer to be abundantly clear. Yes, the time has come for the creation of a place on the National Mall where our most important monuments are located, where we conduct the business of our Congress, pay tribute to our veterans, gather to inaugurate our presidents, and where we give full voice to our freedom of speech. The mall, more than any other public space in our country, should tell the story of America. Recognizing that Latinos were here well before 1776, and that in this new century, our future is increasingly Latino, more than 50 million people, and growing. The Commission investigated 9 sites, and yes, made a recommendation of 1. The Commission believes strongly that the new museum should be a part of our nation's preeminent scientific, research, and cultural institution, the Smithsonian Institution, and when created should be known as the Smithsonian American Latino Museum, free to every American citizen and governed in the same manner and funded in the same manner as the National Museum of the American Indian and the National Museum of African American History and Culture, a place that within the vision of the Smithsonian for the increase and diffusion of knowledge is not just a monument to past accomplishments, but a 21st century learning laboratory connected to cultural centers and schools across the country, recognizing that many American children may never visit Washington, D.C., and yet deserve to have access to great American stories. This is possible because of the work to create and the funding of programs, exhibitions, and curatorial positions established throughout the Smithsonian Museum system over the last 30 years at the American History Museum, the American Art Museum, the National Portrait Gallery, the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum, and the Natural History Museum, and this is just the beginning. These efforts will soon be joined by the privately funded Molina Family Latino Gallery within the walls of the American History Museum, and our collections are accessible to every American citizen through the Smithsonian's Latino Virtual Museum. The National Museum of the American Latino Commission responded to the direction of Congress to engage the American people in order to create a strategic plan for the establishment and maintenance of the museum, to develop a fundraising strategy to support the museum, to report on the availability and cost of collections to be acquired, to examine the impact of this museum on regional Latino museums, to analyze and recommend possible locations for the museum, to recommend whether the museum should be located within the Smithsonian Institution, to recommend a governance and organizational structure for the museum, to engage the American Latino community in the development of the museum, to determine the cost of constructing, operating, and maintaining the museum, and finally, to assist in drafting legislation to carry out the plan of action to create and construct the museum. In May of 2011, in a ceremony at the White House, the members of the commission, ahead of schedule and under budget, delivered to the President of the United States and to members of the Congress a final report containing our in-depth analysis, findings, and recommendations. Based upon our work with a broad group of thought leaders and experts, and most importantly, a dialogue with hundreds of thousands of citizens in communities across the United States, both in person and online, in a first-of-its-kind effort, now carried forward by the Friends of the American Latino Museum, the Commission articulated a comprehensive plan for the establishment of the Smithsonian American Latino Museum. I've attached an executive summary of the Commission's final report for your record, and I'm happy to report that the findings validate the readiness of this idea to be formalized by Congress. It is completely within the capabilities of the Smithsonian Institution and this young, dynamic, fast-growing, and economically significant population of Americans to give birth to and to sustain a new national museum. At this moment in our country's history, when cultural understanding could not be more essential to the enduring strength of our democracy, I am asking on behalf of the American people to carefully consider the importance of creating the Smithsonian American Latino Museum so that we may illuminate the American story for all.
Thank you very much. We'll turn now to you, Dr. Let's see, who am I? Dr. Lou Williams.
Well, I want to thank the committee for holding this hearing and having this conversation, and thank you for allowing me to testify. So every year I begin my semester at Princeton by asking my students, what do you know about Asian Pacific American history? What have you been taught? And the most frequent answer I get is nothing. And when pressed, they will usually recall that the Chinese built the railroad and that Japanese internment was a tragic mistake. Most of the time, they've learned these things thanks to a couple of paragraphs in their high school textbook. And this is true whether they come from New Jersey or from Texas or from Virginia or even from California. Their K-12 education is practically devoid of the history and culture of Asian Pacific Americans. And I think if you think back to your own education, I would wonder what you learned. And according to research, this lack of knowledge that I observe in my classroom is due to a lack of exposure. Studies of U.S. history and government textbook show a startling dearth of content on Asian Pacific Americans. In the National Register of Historic Places, only 3% of sites are associated with their history. And history isn't the only area of neglect. A 2019 study of major U.S. art museums found that only 0.06% of showcased artists are Asian American. What I want to say today is that there's nothing natural about this omission. Asians and Pacific Islanders are the fastest growing racial group in America today, and their history in this country stretches back centuries. The first Chinese immigrants came to America in the 1820s, and their numbers rapidly increased with the 1849 gold rush in California. Chinese workers blasted tunnels through the Sierra Mountains to make way for the Transcontinental Railroad. They drained swamplands to make way for agriculture, and they felled trees needed to construct the towns and cities of the West. They were joined by Japanese, Korean, and Sikh immigrants who labored in the fields and factories. As Asian immigrants remade America's landscape and built America's infrastructure, they also reshaped the legal foundations of the nation. They brought landmark cases before the Supreme Court, which helped to define key concepts of citizenship and equal protection. And as Asian American, Pacific Americans helped to build America, we also need to remember that America built this community through its actions in the world. The Spanish-American War brought Filipinos, Native Hawaiians, Guamanians, Samoans into the national fold. The Vietnam War brought waves of Vietnamese, Cambodians, Lao, and Hmong refugees. I think if we fail to include Asian Pacific Americans in our historical memory, we emerge with a distorted understanding of our nation. If we ignore the history of Chinese exclusion, we can imagine that America once welcomed the huddled masses yearning to breathe free. If we dismiss the Philippines and the Pacific Islands, you can pretend that America was never an empire. If we omit Japanese confinement during World War II, we can forget how quickly wartime hysteria can undermine our constitutional principles. If we want to understand the transformation of American politics, we need to remember women like Representative Patsy Mink, the first woman of color to serve in Congress. And we also need to remember Grace Lee Boggs, a revolutionary who empowered the youth of Detroit. If we want to recognize the richness of American culture, we need to talk about Asian Pacific American food, music, architecture, art, and literature. People go to the Smithsonian to learn about America, who we are as a people and a nation. Our national museums capture the stories we tell about ourselves, about our past, and our future. By creating an Asian Pacific American Smithsonian, Congress could recognize a historically marginalized group and bring them closer to their rightful role in American society and American memory. This would convey a powerful vision of inclusion, diversity, and equality. I urge you to please take the first step in making this vision a reality, to form a commission to consider a national museum of Asian Pacific American history and culture.
Thank you very much. Ms. Sasaki.
Chairperson Lofgren, Ranking Member Davis and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. I'm Lisa Sasaki, and I have the honor of serving as the director of the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center since 2016. Prior to joining the Smithsonian Institution, I spent over 20 years working in the museum field, specifically in community-based museums like the Oakland Museum of California and the Japanese American National Museum. It is my great privilege to work with a talented team of curators, programmers, and professionals to highlight the stories of what is currently the fastest growing racial group in America. An estimated 20 million Asian Pacific Americans and their communities located across the mainland United States and the Pacific. The Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center was established in 1997 as a mission-critical pan-institutional initiative to further the inclusion and representation of Asian Pacific Americans across Smithsonian exhibitions, collections, programs, and research. In its early years, the center produced numerous temporary and traveling exhibitions and hosted notable Asian Pacific American speakers, artists, and performers here in Washington, D.C. Today, the center has expanded to also present digital projects, community-based public programs, and educational resources that bring Asian Pacific American art, history, and culture to a global audience. The center acts as a respected convener and cultural laboratory, working in close partnership with community organizations, scholars, artists, and nationally recognized institutions such as the Library of Congress and the Kennedy Center and other Smithsonian units. The center also administers the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Initiatives Pool, federally appropriated funds that support projects from across the Smithsonian's 19 museums and 9 research centers that focus on contributions and experiences of Asian Pacific Americans through research, acquisitions, programs, exhibitions, new media, publications, and educational activities. Since its creation 4 years ago, this pool has helped to support 49 projects in 16 different Smithsonian units, including the creation of the first ever Curator of Asian Pacific American History position at the National Museum of American History. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today on H.R. 4132, a bill to establish a commission to study the potential creation of a National Museum of Asian Pacific American History and Culture. If Congress deems it in the public interest to move forward with the creation of the commission, the Smithsonian and I stand ready to serve as content experts should the bill pass into public law. In the meanwhile, the center will continue to advance its mandate to increase Asian Pacific American content and focus at the Smithsonian Institution and around the country. Specifically, we have recently launched a comprehensive campaign designed to do the following. 1, create a series of national collecting initiatives with Smithsonian museums to preserve Asian American Pacific stories digitally and through the collections of object, art, and archives. 2, increase the opportunities for Asian Pacific American students and museum professionals within the Smithsonian, helping to create the next generation of scholars, curators, and leaders. And 3, create the first dedicated Asian Pacific American exhibition gallery in Washington, D.C. within the Smithsonian. I also wanted to now take a few words to say a few words about our sister program, the Smithsonian Latino Center, which is directed by my colleague, Eduardo Diaz. Eduardo had planned on testifying before this committee today, but was unable to, unfortunately, due to a death in his family. Fortunately, his written testimony is included for the record of this committee hearing. The Latino Center was created in 1997 to promote Latino presence within the Smithsonian. The center works collaboratively with the institution's museum, research centers, record label, and traveling exhibition service, ensuring that the contributions of the Latino community in helping build this country and shape our national culture are explored, presented, celebrated, and preserved. The center supports research, exhibition, collections, public and education programs, and digital outreach about the U.S. Latino experience, as well as a range of professional development programs in history, arts, culture, and the sciences. Currently, the center is preparing to unveil the first ever Latino gallery on the National Mall, the Molina Family Latino Gallery, which will open at the National Museum of American History in spring 2021. I'm proud that the Latino Center is making great strides to increase the visibility of Latino populations and their rich and culturally diverse stories at the Smithsonian. I'm equally proud to be working at the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center to ensure that Asian Pacific Americans are also recognized. I would like to thank the committee for giving me this opportunity to testify and for your support and interest in the work of the Smithsonian. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, and we'll turn now, Dr. Peterson, to you.
Thank you. Chair Lofgren, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the committee, thank you for your invitation to testify before you today. I've been asked to provide an overview of some of the matters Congress might encounter in the potential consideration and development of new Smithsonian museums. And this comes at a time of great interest in these museums in Congress and among museum advocates. In addition to the potential projects under consideration today, H.R. 1980, as reported by this committee, would create a women's history museum in the Smithsonian. It's unclear whether Congress has ever considered the potential development of three substantial museum projects essentially at the same time. Questions that Congress and this committee might consider regarding museum development range from big picture philosophical considerations to practical and detailed operational concerns, some of which we've heard today. In this oral statement, I'll focus on three areas of concern, including the role and availability of private entities to support museum initiatives, the capacity of the Smithsonian to engage major new museum initiatives, along with a number of current institutional demands, and naturally, the potential costs of establishing and operating new museums. With regard to private interest in museums, the development of the most recent Smithsonian museums, the National Museum of African American History and Culture and the National Museum of the American Indian, suggests that proposals for museums typically grow from initial efforts of private individuals or groups. In considering these proposals, there appears to be a series of around 10 events involving the efforts of supporters, Congress, and the Smithsonian. Private advocates appear to engage in everything from the first idea for a museum to the grand opening, and this can take a long time. 108 years elapsed between the time when George High began his collection and when the Indian Museum first opened its doors. Similarly, the African American History and Culture Museum opened 101 years after the first efforts of African American Civil War veterans to establish and build a museum or monument. In considering the development of new museums, Congress might consider the commitment and capacity of advocates for various museums to work independently and effectively in support of that museum's establishment. Within the Smithsonian, recent and current leaders have taken an arguably discouraging approach to the creation of new museums and have instead advocated in favor of other priorities. The potential need for the Smithsonian to execute the development of as many as 3 new national museums might raise concerns about its capacity to effectively address ongoing operations, resolve longstanding maintenance concerns for existing facilities, in addition to consideration of the museums. In addition to these concerns, the extent to which the Smithsonian Institution has or can develop the human capital capacity to integrate new museums into its portfolio has not been assessed in a publicly available manner. Any of these concerns arguably might inform an assessment of the Smithsonian's ability to successfully develop the new museums under consideration. Finally, if the National American Latino, Asian Pacific American History and Culture, or Women's History Museums are created by Congress, as we've discussed this morning, and they're funded in the same manner as other SI museums, they could represent a significant, enduring increase in the appropriations provided for Smithsonian operations. In advance of a detailed project, it can be difficult to estimate costs for new museums because those costs are going to vary according to the scope of the new museum's mandate, facility size, funding mechanisms, and other factors. Some potential guidance on cost, however, may be drawn from the costs of building and operational expenditures of the American Indian and African American History and Culture museums. For the first 15 years, those museums were in operation, and including the funding for the federal components of museum planning, design, construction, and exhibit development, appropriations for the American Indian Museum were at least $564.9 million, and for the African American History and Culture Museum, at least $644 million. These figures reflect adjustment for inflation to 2019 dollars. Finally, I want to acknowledge the assistance of some very good CRS colleagues, Dr. Jacob Strauss, who's behind me today, and some wonderful librarians who helped me pull together this testimony. That's all I have for now. I appreciate your inviting me to testify, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all the witnesses. I'll turn now to the ranking member, Mr. Davis, for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses. Great to hear your opening testimony, and look forward to working with you as these projects move forward. My first question is for Mr. Munoz. The Commission considered several sites as possible locations. One is the Capitol site on the Senate side of the Capitol, which is under the jurisdiction of the architect of the Capitol. Was the architect consulted on the location, and what input may they have provided?
Yes, they were consulted on the potential location of the museum on that site. It is the one site on the mall that is not under the jurisdiction of the National Parks Service. So during the time of consideration of all 9 sites, we worked through the various organizations that have jurisdiction over the National Mall, for example, the National Capital Planning Commission. Everyone weighed in on that process. In fact, at the end of the day, through all of the planning processes that have considered and continue to evolve what should happen on the National Mall, as far back as Pierre L'Enfant's plan for the city of Washington, D.C., it has always been thought that there would be a significant civic building on that site. It's currently a parking lot. And so at the end of the day, the National Planning Capital Commission said, we believe that some consideration of the rethinking of the entire site, including the reflecting pool, could be enhanced by the location of a building such as a museum, like the National Latino Museum on that site.
Okay, I mean, you mentioned the collaboration. The Park Service obviously was included in this. Did they express any concerns about that location at all?
Well, there's always, I think there's lots of concerns about the complexity of the mall. In every single site that was considered, there were pros and there were cons. The Secretary spoke to one earlier. I might disagree with him on that one, but there are always pros and cons.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for
sure.
your testimony. Mr. Peterson, thank you for being here as one of our witnesses. I forgot to look at your bio again beforehand and realized you didn't go to the University of Illinois. You went to some institution in Ohio that many people haven't heard of.
Actually, I teach.
We'll still consider you somewhat of an expert today on CRS. What are the elements that needed to be considered in order to have a holistic estimate of the financial commitment any new Smithsonian museum would require?
Well, as Dr. Bunch has suggested, there are a number of pieces that we need to think about, from the initial idea through the expenses for a commission of consideration to the unknowable, fully unknowable when we begin costs of construction and then operations. It's very difficult to tie down a specific number ahead of time. I know that some entities have tried, and inevitably they wind up lower than what the actual costs are. But fundamentally, you're looking at paying for the idea stage, paying for the site planning and construction stage, and then paying for the ongoing operations.
You know, we've had previous museums come in at certain estimates and then end up substantially higher, sometimes upwards of 50% increases. Is there something that stands out as a part of those projects that you can't plan for a 50% increase? What is it that we ought to, as a committee, come together and be concerned about to ensure that the estimates reflect the actual costs, and what can we do to help ensure that on the front end?
Arguably, there is a degree of uncertainty that you're not going to overcome at the front end.
Should that be at a 50% degree of uncertainty, or do you think we can minimize that?
I think that's a question for analyzing past estimates and then finding out final costs. So for example, in the case of the African American Museum, nobody really anticipated the challenges the creek running under the mall would pose and the cost increases of having to build a vastly more reinforced foundation. In the case of the American Indian Museum, it was a strange circumstance in that you had a substantial renovation of a museum space in New York, a new building in Suitland for collection storage, and the mall flagship facility. How do you get there? Again, I would prefer to look at the models of expenditures and then perhaps suggest an idea of what the potential overage could be.
Great. Thank you to each of you. I look forward to working with you as this process moves forward. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, the gentleman from California, Mr. Aguilarsman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Munoz, the Latino population in the United States is projected to grow to reach over 100 million people in less than 50 years. HR 2420, the National Museum of the American Latino Act, has strong bipartisan support. The previous panel of members, Mr. Serrano and Mr. Hurd, also another South Texan, we don't hold that against him. But can you explain to the public and to us how establishing this national museum will expand the Smithsonian's representation for Latino voices throughout our country and community?
Well, I would look at it from three perspectives. First of all, the wisdom of the Congress many years ago to establish Latino pool funds has seeded the development of this museum over the course of the last 3 decades. So there are currently curators that are established in each of these museums who are making sure that the American story that is told in those museums is more complete. That was the first step in establishing the scholarship that the Secretary talked about to ultimately build, let's call it a major portal on the mall in Washington, D.C. As that work progressed, everybody agreed that if you have the fastest growing demographic group in the country, as you said, expected to be 100 million people, then it's in the best interests of the country for them to understand who they are as Americans. And that can't really be told without, let's call it a building and a digital architecture and all of the scholarship that is associated with that. I had an interesting experience a few years ago when I was vice chairman of the Smithsonian National Board. I was asked to represent the Smithsonian at a meeting of the ministries of culture of all of the countries in the Americas. We're the only country that doesn't have one. And so when you think about the Smithsonian and all of its, organic glory as a place of scientific research and culture and art, it's really important for this community to see itself as a part of that American story. And it's important for other people to see it too. Last night I was watching and there was a lot of discussion of pilgrims, but not of the true founding of the country, of the intersection that has happened between the indigenous people and the Spaniards, which predates that. And so until that story is told, maybe because the country has this notion of purity, it won't really understand itself as a mixture, a great mixture melting pot of people. So I think that the time is now to do this. Just personal privilege. I don't think there's a better time to do it than when Lonnie Bunch is the secretary of the Smithsonian, because he's actually done it. And I'm sitting there in that room thinking, how wonderful would it be to have a secretary who really understands the process to watch over this, and the Women's Museum.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And can you talk to us a little bit about how your analysis, how the study reviewed the site locations as well? Mr. Davis talked a little bit about that, but the importance of being on the mall, but also some of the concerns associated with some of the other sites as well, and why this might be the most appropriate use, this mall site that was identified.
So there were 9, and not all of them were on the mall in the purest possible thinking. But there's been an evolution in the thinking of the mall. Development never stops, right? The city is evolving. And so there was discussion about what might constitute the mall if you weren't, being traditional thinkers. There were very few. I mean, many people say of our mall thinks that there's too many buildings on the mall already. The National Park Service was completing a study about what the use of the mall should be in the future. This was, on the heels of, like I said, the L'Enfant Plan, the Macmillan Plan, and all of the pertinent organizations with jurisdiction met with us and weighed in on the cost, on issues such as security, on what unforeseen conditions, there's a creek running under them, all of those things. And the commission attempted to balance all of those. There were two overriding considerations. One was location. What had the possibility of fitting in to the ecosystem of institutions on the mall so that it had the broadest exposure possible to the American people. If you were going to choose that, then you might choose what came in second, let's call it, which was the Arts and Industries Building. But the Arts and Industries Building is a historic building. It's been around for a long time, and it probably isn't suitable for a 21st century collecting museum, but it has a great location next to the castle. The second site, which became the preferred site, and quite honestly the site that had a great deal of consideration given to it through these various plans and the National Planning Capital Planning Commission, was the Capitol site. And it, because of where it is, because it has always been anticipated that there would be a major civic building there, because it is currently a parking lot, because it would complete, if you're staring at the Capitol and you looked at the Botanical Garden here, and you looked on this side, if you built a building, maybe it wouldn't be a 500,000 square foot building, but it would be a building that was in harmony with the Botanical Gardens. Well, that was a wonderful thing, and the place where an inaugural parade starts. And so, but there were considerations there too, which is security. It's very close to the Capitol. We thought that was a plus. So at the end of the day, what I want the members of the committee to understand was that there is no perfect site. Everybody was unanimous about the need for this to be on the mall proper. It was a very careful consideration, and at least at that time, knowing that there would have to be further site selection considerations, the site that made the most sense was the Capitol site.
Yes, thanks for your service as well. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. I'll just close out by saying how helpful this hearing has been to me to identify issues. Dr. Peterson, certainly we want to go into this with our eyes wide open, what the issues are, how to cope with them, because those are challenges but not impediments if we plan for them properly. In terms of, the timing, I'm hoping we can move forward on this. Certainly, the idea that we'd wait 100 years for this is completely unacceptable, and our two of our three congressional witnesses are retiring at the end of this Congress. They both said they hoped we could act before they do. That seems like a reasonable request, and I'm hoping that we can proceed. Certainly, the Latino Museum has already done its commission. We're in a position to move forward, and as Secretary Bunch has said, you never get to the end if you don't take the first step, and that's really where we are. In terms of citing, as I was listening to you, I was remembering back to the building of the World War II memorial. And there was a lot of dissension and fighting about that, and there was a strong sense that we should move forward. And I'm a huge environmentalist, but there was going to be environmental delays that went on and on and on. And Senator Bob Dole and I, an unlikely couple, decided to go after this. And I remember a press conference that Senator Dole and I had about this, and he said that, if we wait till all the World War II vets are gone, that will not be acceptable. Now, obviously, the Latino Americans and Asian Americans are not going anywhere, but we have a moment in time here with Secretary Bunch, who knows how to do this, the excitement in the country and in the Congress to proceed. We should take advantage of this moment to move forward. I was thinking about going to New Mexico years ago and meeting with various legislators whose families have been in New Mexico for like 300 years. My grandfather came here, right just before World War I. Their families extend centuries, and yet their story is not fully told. What a great opportunity it is to build the full story of America for all of us to have pride in. So I'm hoping to move that forward. I do have a question really for the Asian Pacific Islander Museum, because this is a commission, how we're going to structure this to fully capture the great diversity of the Asian American, Asian Pacific Islander Museum. And I'm not critical because it's the pattern. The members of the commission, it's 2 members from the majority leader of the Senate, 2 from the Speaker, 2 from the minority leader of the House and the Senate. It's a small commission, and yet we have Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, we have Indo-Americans who are also very diverse, Sikhs, Hindus, Baha'is, Muslims, we have Tongans, we have Nepalese, it just goes on and on. Such a diverse Vietnamese Americans, such a diverse Asian community. How will we approach capturing the diversity that has so blessed our country?
Would you like to go first?
I would say that the diversity of the community is one of the reasons that we need a standalone museum to try to capture what is an incredibly diverse and distinct, many histories, many stories of many people. I would say that as a historian, as an academic, that academics have been working on this project for a long time. As a field, Asian American studies is about 50 years old, and the study of Asian immigrants and Asian and Pacific Islanders goes back before that. So I think that we have the academic resources to think about this community as a community together. Perhaps Ms. Suzuki can talk about, Sasaki could talk about the community and how the community can come together. I think that the fact that it's so many stories means that just the building, just having a commission and then imagining such a bringing together of these many histories would be a productive thing for the Asian Pacific American community to imagine how we tell this story that is so often overlooked.
Do you have anything to add?
Yes, thank you so much for bringing this up, because I think this is an opportunity for us to recognize that the commission, should it go forward, has a very important job to do, which is call together as many experts, scholars, and community members from across all of these different communities in order to be able to talk about the impacts of their history, their stories, the opportunities that we have to share about this larger American story that we all contribute to. And I think that with the recognition of that from the very beginning about how complex this endeavor will be, given the diversity of all of the communities that fall underneath the umbrella of Asian Pacific America, that we have a great opportunity to bring together amazing scholars like my colleague here, who can help us better unpack and talk about how we are going to be able to represent those stories in what will ultimately never be enough space.
Well, I'm going to thank each of you for being here today as witnesses. It was very important to hear from you. The committee may have additional questions, which we will send to you. If so, and if we do that, we would ask that you respond in writing as quickly as you can. And I'm just thinking, we're really the only country in the world that's completely made up of people from someplace else, other than our Native Americans. And it's the kind of country, it's not where you're from, it's where you're going that matters, but you always have to remember where you're from as well. Such a rich opportunity we have here to further strengthen America through understanding all of the people who are here and what makes us great. Thank you very much, and we're now adjourned.